What if the pretend boyfriend you hire to survive a family reunion turns your whole world tenderly right side up? In small-town Ohio, two men stage a harmless lie, then stumble into something soft, brave, and real, where every borrowed touch asks, what if we never stop pretending? Maybe love was the plan. Subscribe, breathe deep, and lean in. If this story finds you, share it, like it, and keep listening together tonight. If you've ever driven home at dusk on a Midwestern highway, you already know the way the sky softens into a quilt of lavender and blue, how the fields spread out like a deep breath, how every mile whispers, "You remember who you are, don't you?" That was the road I took back to Maple Ridge with a stranger beside me pretending to be my boyfriend. He had a duffel bag under his feet, a smile I couldn't stop glancing at, and a promise to be kind about it all, even if the whole thing felt like a small miracle balanced on a very thin line. "Rules," Micah said, tapping the steering wheel with his index finger as we rolled past a barn painted the exact red of old pennies. "We need rules." "You're the professional," I said, putting my coffee back in the cup holder I'd already missed twice because my hands were jittery. "I figured you'd tell me what they are." He laughed, not unkindly. It was the kind of laugh that sounds like it started in his chest and had to make its way up carefully. Professional is a big word for a guy who answers a Craigslist offshoot and brings his own travel mug. But yeah, rules. He'd shown up at the coffee shop on 3rd Street in Columbus wearing a denim jacket and a scarf with tiny white birds printed on the dark blue fabric. He had hazel eyes that looked green when the light hit, and a way of listening that made me feel like I was saying something worth hearing even when I was only ordering an oat milk latte. He'd slid into the seat across from me, asked for the details, and I'd told him the truth. My sister was getting married in Maple Ridge, and family was flying in from everywhere. And my mother had been leaving me voicemails that started as reminders about the rehearsal dinner and shifted into gentle sighs about how nice it would be if I brought someone. Anyone, because she worried that my heart was turning into a room I kept locked, and she couldn't stand the thought of me being alone by the time the cake was cut. "And your ex?" Micah had asked at the cafe, tilting his head. He had a good tilting head face, interested but not pushy. "Craig," I said. "Yes, he'll be there. He's friends with everyone, in the way that makes you question your memories." "And you want a buffer," Micah said. "A handsome, charming, absolutely fake boyfriend buffer." "Exactly. And I can pay. Not a lot, but..." He'd put his hand up. "We'll figure it out. I like weddings, and I've taken stranger gigs. Babysat a boa constrictor during a block party once. Paid in barbecue ribs." Long story. Now he was in my passenger seat, a notebook open on his lap. The pages already filled with careful notes in tidy handwriting, how we supposedly met, a neighborhood festival. What I did in Columbus, marketing at a nonprofit that paired literacy tutors with second graders. What he did, part-time acting, part-time catering, part-time a dozen other things that added up to a miracle of rent paid each month. And the little details that make a story feel real. He'd ask the smallest questions. "What's your favorite rainy day soup? Do you take your shoes off at the door? Do you sing in the shower?" He was stitching us into something. "Okay," he said. "Boundaries. Public affection is okay if you're okay with it. Hand-holding, arm around your shoulder, the occasional sweet forehead kiss if and whoever needs convincing." "Enid," I said. "But she doesn't need convincing. Enid needs something to talk about on her group chat. Then we'll give Enid a show that's sweet but respectful." "Great. Second rule, a signal if you're overwhelmed. Choose a word. Nothing we'd use in normal conversation." "Marigold," I said, because my mom had planted them every May in a perfect border around the porch. "Marigold," he repeated, and I didn't plan on how good my name sounded when he said it. Except he hadn't said my name, just the flower. And even that sounded like something I wanted to hear again later. Third rule, if anyone asks very personal questions, we answer together. You don't have to carry that alone. I switched lanes, the highway gently arcing like an arm around the shoulder of the town beyond. "You make it sound like we're going into battle." "We're going into love's lobby," he said, smiling sideways at me. People get brave there. And messy. He had this way of talking that put a soft ribbon around my fear. I glanced at him again and caught him looking back at me, and we both looked away like we didn't want to scare the moment off. My heart did that small animal thing inside my chest, putting its paw on the glass and watching. "Tell me about Maple Ridge," he said. "It's where the best cinnamon rolls come from," I said. "My mom's kitchen smells like brown sugar every holiday. There's a green where people still wave to each other. The hardware store has been owned by the same family since the 40s. I had my first kiss behind the library when I was 17 and thought I'd discovered a secret language nobody else knew." Micah closed his notebook. "We'll be careful with your language," he said, soft. "We're going to make it feel safe again." He meant it. I could hear it. I took the exit. The town looked like it was waiting for a story. The church steeple rose above the willows. The brick storefronts caught the low sun, and there were kids on bikes cutting quiet arcs across the street. My parents lived in a white clapboard house with a porch swing that had been repainted so many times the layers were like the rings of a tree. We parked under the maple that had given the town its name, and the air smelled like cut grass and someone's grill. "Ready?" Micah asked. "No," I said. "But yes." We walked up the front steps as if we had choreographed it. He didn't reach for my hand until I reached for his, like we were both checking each other's bravery. And when our fingers interlocked, it wasn't fireworks. It was a small lamp turned on in a room I hadn't realized was dim. It was enough. My mother had her apron on and her hair pinned back with the same clip she'd worn to every school concert I'd ever played in. And she smelled like cinnamon and soap and something else I had always called home. She took one look at Micah and beamed. "You must be the famous Micah." "I didn't know I was famous," he said, offering his hand and then his shoulder because my mother pulled him into a hug anyway. "But I will try to live up to the legend." My dad came from the den with reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He shook Micah's hand with that old Midwest seriousness that says I'm paying attention to who you are. "Welcome," he said, and when he looked at me, I saw the question he didn't say. "Are you okay? Are you happy?" I nodded. Maybe I was. Maybe I could be. We all moved toward the kitchen like planets finding their orbit. My sister, Lena, breezed in with a tote bag overflowing with ribbon and a face that had been covered in joy for the last 6 months. Behind her, her fiancé, Tyler, carried in 2 cases of sparkling water like he was hauling a river. And then there were cousins and aunts and uncles and my grandmother in her floral dress, all filling the house with voices. And stories and the good noise you forget you've missed, until it comes back and sits at your table. Micah found a way to fit himself into every moment without taking any of them over. He asked my grandmother about her first dance with my grandfather. He offered to chop walnuts for the apple salad and took instruction like the recipe was an heirloom. He let my nephew Milo put stickers on his arm and didn't peel them off until Milo had said they were allowed to go. "But keep the star," Milo commanded. And Micah did for the rest of the night, a tiny gold star shining on his wrist. I watched him, not like I was supposed to be playing a part, but like I'd forgotten the part and found something else. He moved around the room as if he'd been in it 1,000 times, and every time our eyes met, he did that small, crinkling smile that felt like a private joke shared in good faith. When Aunt Enid arrived, already wrapped in the story of her own arrival, Micah somehow turned the conversation away from how long he'd been with me to how Enid had decorated her porch for Halloween last year with 31 pumpkins, each carved with a different face. I could feel my shoulders dropping from around my ears. At dinner, when the table filled with roast chicken and green beans and a pie, my mother swore wasn't ready. Micah sat beside me and we took turns reaching for the same dish at the same time, our knuckles bumping like they were learning each other's map. He touched the back of my chair when he leaned to hear my dad. He folded my napkin when it slid off my lap, and when the conversation turned to long-distance relationships, he met my cheek with a quick, soft kiss. It was almost nothing. It was everything. The room didn't spin, but it felt like it could have. After we washed dishes together, sleeves pushed up, music from the 70s low on the radio. Micah hummed under his breath, and I wondered what songs were tucked into his throat. He asked about my job, truly, not just the headline. I asked about the other gigs he took. He told me about the time he'd been hired as a mystery dinner date at a corporate event and ended up teaching the CFO how to two-step. "So you're a good dancer?" I said. "I can count to 8, he replied, rinsing a plate. "But I like swaying more than spinning." We can sway at the reception, I said, before I remembered this was supposed to be a rehearsal, a story we were telling for a couple of days. He didn't blink. I'd like that, he said. Simple. We slept in the guest room with its quilt and its old oak dresser and the window that looked out over the garden my dad tended like a psalm. There were 2 twin beds pushed against opposite walls like a childhood summer camp. Micah put his duffel down gently like he didn't want to be rude to the furniture. Is this okay? He asked when the door was closed and the house had shifted to its nighttime breathing. We can move the beds if you want, but I don't want to seem like we're trying too hard. It's perfect, I said, because it was. There was something old-fashioned about it that eased everything. He set his phone on the nightstand and turned to me. Marigold, if anything feels too much, he said again. Not because he thought I'd forget, but because he wanted me to feel wrapped. Marigold, I echoed. I thought I'd lie awake and devise scripts for every encounter the next day. Instead, I listened to the summer insects, and I watched the ceiling fan slice the night into comfortable pieces, and I drifted. At somewhere that was probably almost morning, I woke to a quiet sound, a shift, a breath that caught. Micah was turned toward the window, eyes glinting in the streetlight, not asleep. I waited, because sometimes the best thing to do for a person is to wait. I always sleep weird in new places, he whispered, after a moment. My brain has this whole neighborhood watch thing it does. I can put on a podcast, I said. My dad's favorite is 3 people in their 60s talking about trains. He smiled in the dark. Tempting. I think I can find my way back. Thank you, though. Do you want... I'd meant to say water, or an extra blanket, but the word that came out was company. It landed in the space between us like a coin. He was quiet long enough for me to be grateful for the dark. Then he said, "Would you mind?" in a voice that made the coin worth something. He pulled his quilt off his bed and stepped across the small space and sat on the edge of mine like a careful bird. He didn't get under the covers, just leaned back against the headboard, shoulder warm near mine. We didn't hold hands. We didn't need to. The room did that for us. Tomorrow, he said softly, I'll make sure nobody says anything that makes you small. Thank you, I said. Then, because respect moves both ways, tomorrow, I'll make sure nobody makes you feel like you're something bought. He turned his head. In the faint light, I could see the curve of his mouth. Deal, he said, and we slept. Rehearsal day in Maple Ridge is an event disguised as a series of errands. We woke to the smell of coffee and my mother's humming, and the house began to accumulate flowers and cousins and cases of sparkling cider. Micah wore a short-sleeved button-down dotted with tiny anchors. He listened to my mom's instructions like each one was a note he was grateful to hear. He carried boxes, entertained Milo, and helped my grandmother find her shawl in the guest room dresser without prying into its top drawer, which contained a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon that had lived there longer than I have. On the church green, while the rehearsal party waited for the pastor whose alarm had not gone off, a story he would tell with good humor and mild embarrassment for the rest of the day, Micah took my hand like he'd been doing it for a decade. Not a performance, just a habit we discovered had been ours all along. It made the air feel easier. People saw us and smiled. That's the thing about a small town. It can hurt you with what it thinks it knows, but it can also hold you if you let it. Daniel, a voice said. And I knew who it was before he came into view, because there was a way he said my name that always sounded like a shrug. Craig, he'd driven in from Cleveland in a car that cost more than my student loans, and had sunglasses he didn't need because the sun was behind the clouds, but he liked the idea of needing them. He hugged me like he was still allowed to. I went stiff and didn't want to, and then Micah was there, hand warm between my shoulder blades, a tether. And you are? Craig said, flicking his gaze over Micah like he was choosing fruit. New. This is Micah, I said. My boyfriend, Micah smiled. Nice to meet you, Craig, he said in the voice he used when he wanted someone to remember that being seen was a privilege, not a right. He shook Craig's hand and didn't flinch. So, Craig said, turning to me, you made it out of the city. That's good. What do you do again? Marketing, I said. At a nonprofit. How noble, he said, as if nobility were a polite joke. Still writing in your spare time? I write when I can, I said, a steadying breath. He had that way of making the thing you loved sound like a hobby you'd someday outgrow. Micah leaned in just slightly, so that when he spoke, it felt like he was talking to both of us. He writes well, he said. He wrote a story about a kid learning to read that made me cry in the middle of a coffee shop. I had to pretend there was dust in my eye. There wasn't. It was just good. Craig's mouth did a small, involuntary move. He wasn't used to someone stepping into my story on purpose. He pushed his sunglasses up on his head and gave what he probably thought was a generous smile. Well, he said. Good for you. We moved on. We had a rehearsal to rehearse. The pastor arrived, apologizing and full of jokes about clocks conspiring. We walked up the aisle that had held my childhood at least 3 times. For baptism, for school recitals, for the one day I sat in the back and didn't believe. I took a breath. Micah squeezed my hand. Everything softened just a bit, the way a new pair of shoes does when you finally trust them. At the potluck in the fellowship hall that followed the rehearsal, between the potato salad with dill and the Jell-O with things floating in it my mother had never approved, I realized Micah had memorized the names of people most people only pretend to know. He called Mr. Franklin from the hardware store by his first name, asked about his hip, congratulated the twins who'd just graduated on their scholarships, and told my cousin Jenna that the sweater she was wearing made her look like the best version of fall. He meant it, and she knew. He also kept checking on me, not in a hovering way, but in a quiet, "Hey, you okay?" kind of way that you can feel across a crowded room like a small bird landing in your chest. I was more than okay. There was a moment, though, when everything tipped, like the camera had pulled back and we remembered ourselves. My mother, gently meddling, suggested we tell the story of how we met, and Micah, as planned, began to say something about the neighborhood festival. I looked at him, the light catching the side of his face, the slow way he turned toward me like I was something to be turned toward. And the story we had invented felt like a sweater I hadn't realized was a little too tight. We actually met, I said, because I was told I needed to meet him. The room went quiet, but not unkindly. My mother's hands paused mid-air with a spoon. Micah kept his eyes on mine. I was scared, I said. And I asked for help. Micah is very good at helping. He could have laughed. He could have shifted us into another gear. He didn't. He nodded like the truth had just walked into the room and he was going to pull out a chair for it. And then we rehearsed, he said, because he's kind, and we learned our favorite soups and whether we sing in the shower and the places we're tender. And now we're here. We're doing fine. His hand found my knee under the table. Gentle as a post-it note with a heart drawn on it left on your desk in the middle of a hard day. My mother, who believes in honesty and warm bread, exhaled in a way that said she was proud of both things. I like him, she said, in the voice she uses when she's trying not to cry. I like you better with him. We all laughed, and there it was again. That little click where everything settled. That night, after everyone left their dishes in my mother's sink and promised to return before noon the next day, Micah and I sat on the front steps and watched fireflies turn the yard into a slow, twinkling metropolis. The porch light was off. The stars were doing their attentive work. My dad had gone to bed with a library book balanced on his chest, and my mother had put the last of the pie away like she was tucking it in. Thank you, I said to Micah, because there are things you should never let go unsaid. For today, for that moment with Craig, for everything. He didn't shrug it off. He wasn't a shrugger. He looked at me in a way that made me want to sit up a little straighter, like I was in the presence of something worth standing for. You're welcome, he said. Thank you for making room for me to be here as myself. You were perfect, I said. I was present, he corrected softly. Perfect is too slippery, but I was here. We were very close. The kind of close that makes the air hum. He could have kissed me. I could have kissed him. We didn't. We did something that at the time felt smaller and now, telling you this, feels bigger. He leaned his head onto my shoulder and I rested my cheek against his hair and we breathed. You don't always have to name things to know what they are. Tomorrow, he said into my shirt, I might cry. Weddings do that to me. Not the vows, necessarily. The quiets. The small hands holding big ones. The dance between a father and daughter. Someone picking a piece of lint off someone else's suit jacket. The small kindnesses. They undo me. I'll be there, I said. I'm a champion lint picker. He laughed. And if you've ever been the person who got someone to laugh right when they needed to, you know what that feels like in your bones. He lifted his head. The stars were very bright. We went inside. The wedding day arrived like a brass band that woke up early. There were flowers and vases on every surface and a hair and makeup team installed in the living room by 9. Lena floated. Tyler did that thing where he pretended he wasn't nervous and then asked everyone where his cufflinks were 60 times. Micah moved through the house like he'd been assigned the role of gentleness and was absolutely committed to it. We got dressed in the guest room. He tied my tie with a concentrated tongue tip peeking between his teeth. I adjusted the anchor shirt he'd ironed. We stood side by side in the mirror, and for a second, it was like watching a life we hadn't planned but wanted. I felt a tremor, not of fear, but of recognition, like a bell rung very far away had finally reached us. You okay? He asked, his voice a low hum. Marigold, I said, but I didn't mean stop. I meant be close. He understood. He touched the middle of my back. I breathed. We went. On the lawn behind the church, beneath a rented arbor wrapped in white fabric and eucalyptus, my sister married the person I'd known was for her from the second he brought her soup when she had the flu and took out her trash without being asked. The vows were like good bread, simple, nourishing, the kind you want to break open and share. Micah, as promised, cried at the smallnesses. When my grandmother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief she'd carried since 1961, he looked at me like he could feel time folding tenderly. At the reception in the community center, between the first dance and the family photo where Aunt Enid insisted on swapping places to find her light, I found Micah near the punch bowl, talking to Mr. Franklin about the proper way to stop a squeak in a hinge. He was lit up from the inside in a way I'd never seen in the city, or maybe I hadn't been looking. I set 2 small plates on the table beside him, the kind with a piece of carrot cake and a small pile of fruit that gets ignored. We haven't danced, I said. He turned toward me like a tide. Let's fix that, he said, and he held out his hand. We didn't spin, we swayed. It felt like a new chapter. It felt like reading the words out loud and realizing how they sound when the air holds them too. He rested his forehead against mine, and the room, with all its plastic cups and string lights and cousins, went quiet for a second, like we had stepped underneath a shared umbrella. The song wasn't one I knew, but it became one. We marked the floor gently, like we were leaving a map for people who needed to find their way back later. I keep thinking, he whispered, how strange it is that we're pretending in front of an entire town, and it feels less like pretending with every minute. I know, I said, the words catching like coat hooks. Is that dangerous? Probably, he said, and the small smile at the corner of his mouth was both an answer and a promise. The danger arrived in the shape of a well-meaning cousin and a phone screen. It was after the toasts, when the room had softened around the edges, and the kids were under tables making caves out of napkins. I had gone to find my mother's glasses case. Micah had stepped outside to take a call from a catering client who was trying to move a shift. The cousin, Sam, who had always been more curious than careful, came up to me with a face that said he had found a thing and needed to show somebody. Is this? He said, and turned his phone so I could see. It was a screenshot of a payment app, my name. A memo line that said, Weekend Boyfriend. He looked both delighted with his detective work and genuinely unsure what to do. Now that he'd done it, there are moments when you can feel your whole body choose a direction. I could feel shame rising, old and ready. But I also felt something else, a steadiness that wasn't mine alone. It was in the way my father had set his hand on my shoulder when I came out to him 10 years ago, and he'd said, so we'll make sure you're loved then. It was in the way Micah had tied my tie. It was in my mother's cinnamon rolls and my grandmother's shawl and my sister's vows. I could feel the architecture of my life. Sam, I said, quiet. I asked for help. I hired someone to be with me this weekend because I was afraid of this exact moment and because I wanted to feel safe. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain farther than that. Please don't make this into gossip. If you have questions, ask me, or ask Micah, but be kind, okay? He blinked. For a second, the old gleeful spark hovered, and then it left. He put the phone away. Okay, he said, his voice chastened in the way of someone remembering he's part of a family. I didn't mean I know, I said, and because I did know. Because intent matters, and impact matters, and both can exist in the same room and still be survived. I took a breath and put my hand on his shoulder. You can help by fetching out Enid for the bouquet toss. She's plotting something. He ran off, grateful to have a job. I exhaled. Micah came back through the door then, sliding into the room with a gust of evening air. One look at my face and he was beside me. What happened? He asked. Cousin Sherlock, I said. Payment app. He knows. Micah watched my eyes like he was reading a gauge. And you? And I told him the truth, I said. And asked him to be kind. My voice broke just a little on the last word, because sometimes asking for kindness is the bravest thing we do. Micah's hand found mine under the table. He didn't say good job or I'm proud. He said, that's hard, like he knew it. He pressed our knuckles together. My client wants me tomorrow morning, he said, and this felt like the second part of a sentence that had been waiting to be said. In the city, early. I can push them, but I don't know how far. I said I'd let them know by 10. It was like we were in a very small boat and someone had said, there might be a storm, so you might leave, I said. I might have to, he said carefully. I don't want to. But I'm a person whose rent is a puzzle. And also, he stopped. In the pause, we both heard the music, the clink of glasses, the laughter that sounds like home when it's not hurting you. It's complicated, he finished. Complicated is honest, I said. Do what you need to. I meant it, and I also didn't. And if you've ever loved anything at all, you know exactly what that feels like. He nodded. We danced again. He cried at the smallest moment of the night, my dad slipping his cufflink back into place in the corner of the room with hands that still knew elegant work. We ate too much cake. We took a photo in the photo booth where Micah put on a foam hat and looked like a very charming disaster. We closed the community center and went home in the kind of quiet that happens when happiness and fear have decided to sit together and not make a fuss. In the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed and took off my shoes like they weighed less than they looked. Micah leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, tie loosened, anchor shirt untucked. He looked tired and beautiful in that way people do when they've used all their kindness in one day and still found more. I can stay, he said, the words careful, like he'd been sanding them down to make sure they wouldn't splinter. I can tell them I'm sick. I can take the hit. It wouldn't be the first time. What would you want if it were only you? I asked. His eyes were steady on mine. I'd want to stay, he said. I'm surprised by how much. But if you needed the money, I said, because love doesn't plug every hole in the roof, no matter what the songs say. I'd want to go, he admitted. We were both quiet. In another life, in a movie that doesn't know the price of groceries, he would have chosen me without thinking, and the string section would have swelled. But we were here, in a small room with 2 beds and a window, and the real world knocked on the door right on time. Tell them you'll be late, I said. Stay through breakfast. Say you have a family thing. It's true. Then go and do your life. And then, he asked, and his voice was softer than anything I'd heard all week. And then maybe we see if we still want to hold hands on Monday, I said. Without a job attached, he crossed the room. He stood in front of me and touched the side of my face with his palm like he was telling me a secret and wanted it to land somewhere it would be safe. I don't want this to be pretend, he said. Not anymore. I know, I said. Me neither. He kissed me then. Slow, like the way you open a book you've been waiting to read. It wasn't fireworks. It was a porch light turned on, and we stepped into the circle of it together. We kept it simple. We kept it honest. It was exactly right. He stayed. He called his client and said he needed to leave by noon, which was a different kind of miracle. He helped my mother set the table for the next day's leftover feast. He sat on the porch swing with my dad and talked about baseball and scriptures and the way people sometimes surprise you in good ways. He told my grandmother she was the best dancer in the room. He built a Lego fire truck with Milo. He was not a pretend thing in any of those moments. At breakfast, my mother made cinnamon rolls that could make you believe in second chances. The icing pooled in the center like a blessing. We ate and we laughed, and at one point, when the table was loud with 3 different conversations, and I looked down the line and saw every person who had ever made me feel like the world was bearable, I felt something click again, and I knew it would be okay, no matter how the next part went. Micah and I walked to his ride share at 11:30. The hydrants looked like little sentinels, and the neighbor's dog barked as if he knew we were leaving and had notes. We stood on the sidewalk like people in a painting in ordinary clothes with a very unordinary amount of tenderness between us. "I'll text you when I get there," he said. "Text me on your break," I said, "and on your lunch, and after," he said, smiling. "And if I cry at small kindnesses during a catering shift, you get a full report." "Deal," I said. "I want all the reports." We kissed again, quick and sure and quiet. The car pulled up, he got in. He waved at me through the window like we were already a couple from a song. I watched the car until it turned the corner and disappeared, and then I stood for another minute. Because sometimes you need to let the air settle around the shape an absence makes before you go back inside and keep going. He texted when he got there. He texted a photo of a tray of deviled eggs that looked like they'd been arranged by a person who had spent time thinking about spirals. He sent me a voice memo on his break describing a woman who had spent all morning making sure everyone else had water and only took a sip when someone pressed a glass into her hand, and how he had seen it and wanted to tell her she was seen. He sent me a photo of himself in the walk-in refrigerator making a thumbs-up face and a caption that said, "It's very cold in here." I look brave, but I am not. I sent him a picture of my mother's cinnamon rolls and a caption that said, "Enid wants your recipe for charm." By Monday, the weekend had become a story, and stories can be tricky. They can stop or they can keep going. I went back to the city. I sat at my desk at the nonprofit and answered emails and scheduled volunteers and ate a yogurt with granola that crunched too loud. I looked at my phone too much. He texted around 1, a photo of a bus stop, gray sky, a pigeon doing its best. It said, "I have 15 minutes. Can I take you for coffee around the corner like a regular person who wants to see you?" I stood up so fast my chair made a sound. "Going out," I told my coworker, who made a heart with her hands, because I had told her everything last week when the panic had still been bright. On the corner, Micah stood holding 2 cups and looking like a Monday had tried to make him tired and failed. He handed me one. It had my name written on it in his tidy handwriting. It was the smallest thing. It was huge. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I said. We sat on a concrete ledge and watched people be themselves. We didn't make a plan for forever. We didn't need to. We made a plan for Saturday. For dinner at the little place with the red chairs. For a walk after. For stopping at the bodega with the cat who sleeps on the newspapers and buying a pint of ice cream and 2 spoons. For seeing what our hands did with nothing performing for them. For seeing what our mouths did when they weren't trying to teach a room how to believe in a thing. For telling the aunt who would find out anyway and making sure she got to be proud of us in the story. Saturday came. We sat at the red chairs. We ate pasta that tasted like somebody had been patient with it. We walked. We bought the ice cream. We watched a couple in their 70s share a napkin like a secret, and we looked at each other like we understood something about time and what it lets you keep if you're careful. He reached for my hand, not because we had to, but because it made the evening line up. It felt easy. It felt like breathing. That's what I want for you. If you're listening to this and wondering if the lobby of love is too crowded for you, it isn't. There's a chair with your name on it. You can sit. You can stay. Months went by. Not in a montage, but in the way life goes by when you're paying attention. My lease renewal came and we talked about neighborhoods. His gigs shifted and we talked about steadier work and how to get there without losing the parts of him that liked the edges. He started teaching a Saturday morning theater class for kids at the community center, and I watched him show them how to find their voices and not be ashamed of them, and I wanted to stand up and clap sometimes. We learned each other's grocery store preferences, fought in small ways about whether dishes should be rinsed before they go in the dishwasher, yes, or whether cold pizza is acceptable, it is, and called each other when the day leaned too hard. We took the train back to Maple Ridge in November just before Thanksgiving. The fields had turned to a different palette, all gold and quiet, and the sky had that particular shade of pale that happens when it's thinking about snow. We brought a bouquet for my mother and a baseball trivia book for my dad. We brought a new Anchor mug for Micah to keep at my parents' house. It felt like leaving a toothbrush. It felt like being asked to stay. When we pulled up, my mom cried in the doorway like the movies say mothers do, and my dad hugged Micah and said, "You like the Guardians now, don't you?" And Micah said, "I love whoever you love." And my dad laughed with a sound I hadn't heard from him in years. We put our bags in the guest room, but the beds had been pushed together, and there was a new quilt my mother had made with the leftover fabric from 3 decades of Halloweens and one white square stitched in the middle that said, "Come back whenever you need to." At dinner, Aunt Enid strutted into the room with a turkey pin on her sweater and a face that said, "I know everything and choose to be delighted by it." She hugged Micah like he was family, and when she put her napkin in her lap, she looked at me across the table and said, "I like him. And then because we are who we are, and he can come help me with my porch pumpkins next year." After pie, my grandmother took Micah's hand and said, "You remind me of someone I loved when I was young. He was kind in silences." Micah kissed her cheek. "I hope I am," he said. There was a moment, late, when the dishes were stacked and the house had turned into that particular kind of warmth that only happens when there's nowhere else to be, that I looked at Micah and he was looking back like he could feel the same quiet thunder. We had made it up, and then we had made it true. Not because we forced the story to match the script, but because we let the script go when the truth asked for the microphone. If you're listening to this, and you've ever thought about hiring a stranger to play a part in your life, I'm not here to tell you to do it or not do it. I'm here to tell you that sometimes the way home is strange, and sometimes the thing you rehearse becomes the thing you live, and sometimes the dangers have to be named out loud so they stop pretending to be safety. I'm here to tell you that kindness is the heat that makes everything rise, that the hand on your back at the right moment can help you walk into a room that used to scare you and leave with a slice of pie and your dignity intact. I'm here to tell you we went slow. We learned new rules that were ours alone. We called marigolds sometimes, not because we were in trouble, but because we wanted to remember the day we decided to be careful with each other. We put the Anchor mug in the cupboard beside a row of others, and it looked like it had always been there. We made soup on rainy days and sang in the shower sometimes and planted marigolds around our own small porch the first spring we spent together. When we slowed dance now, in the kitchen, or in the cereal aisle because a good song came on, or in a friend's living room where the furniture had been pushed against the walls to make room for a new year, we still counted to 8, but only so we could ignore it. We swayed. We put our foreheads together and made the room go quiet. We saved our tears for the small kindnesses, and there were a lot of them, more than I'd counted on, which is saying something, because I counted for a living, and then I stopped and I started writing instead. I wrote down the ways people show up for each other and the courage it takes to say, "This is the person I brought, and I want him to be treated like a treasure." I wrote down the way my dad looks at Micah now, as if he was always going to arrive and we just didn't know it. I wrote down the way my mother set a place at the table without asking, and how that felt like being chosen. And on the first anniversary of the weekend that turned a pretend thing into a life, we went back to the church green not because we needed a ceremony, but because we wanted to stand in a place where we had been brave. The grass was brown and the wind kept trying to convince us our ears were cold enough to go inside. But we held hands and we said the simple versions of the only vows I think matter. I will not let the world make you smaller. I will not let anyone make you feel like you can be bought. We kissed, even though our noses were freezing, and then we went to the hardware store and bought a little bell to hang on our own back door so we could listen to the sound of coming home every time we walked in. It is not always easy. Sometimes work is a puzzle and money is a math problem and people are people and they forget to be gentle. Sometimes I am afraid of being known and Micah wants to fix all the squeaks at once. Sometimes I pick a fight because I am tired, and sometimes he goes quiet because he thinks silence is safer than saying the hard thing out loud. But we learned our rules and we changed them when we needed to, and we made new ones too. We eat breakfast together on Sundays. We text each other a small kindness we witnessed every day. We buy porch pumpkins from Aunt Enid. We try to be the kind of people who keep the door unlocked during dinner on nights when we know someone might need to walk in without knocking. If you were sitting across from me right now, if we were sharing the last piece of cinnamon roll and I could see the way you keep checking your phone because someone out there might be your safe place, I would tell you this: the real feelings won't wait for a perfect moment. They arrive in the middle of a rehearsal, or while you're rinsing dishes, or in the car with a stranger who becomes a Monday you look forward to. Your job is to notice. Your job is to tell the truth when you can. Your job is to let the porch light be on. A long time from now, when the marigolds have had 1,000 summers, when the Anchor mug has a small chip on its rim from the day we tried to fix the cabinet and you told me to please call a professional next time, when the kids in Micah's class have grown up and still send him pictures of their first plays and their first jobs and their first apartments, when my stories have turned into a stack of paper that smells like old ink and potholes and hope, I want to remember the exact sound the bell on our back door makes in the early evening when he comes home and puts his keys in the dish. It's small. It lasts a second. And it is the sound of love choosing you on an ordinary day, which is the only day love really has. So, if you find yourself one day making a list in a coffee shop with someone who has hazel eyes and a scarf with birds, and a way of taking notes that makes you feel like a person worth learning, if you find yourself driving back to a town that smells like cinnamon and cut grass, if you find yourself standing on a porch with your hand halfway to another hand and wondering if you should keep going, I hope you do. I hope you reach, and I hope the person meets you there. And I hope the people inside the house are gentle, and the dog barks, and the fireflies do their good work, and the night lets you sleep. I hope the small kindnesses undo you in the best way. I hope the pretend thing gives way to the true thing without making too much of a fuss about who did what first. And if anyone asks later, when the guest room beds are pushed together, and the quilt has a square with your names stitched in cursive by a woman who loves you like oxygen, if anyone asks how you met, you can tell them the truth. You can say, we were brave in a very specific way at a very particular time, and we rehearsed, and then we stopped rehearsing, and it turns out you don't need a better meet cute than that. You can say, he cried at the smallest moments, and it made me love the world more. You can say, we decided to be careful with each other, and then we learned how to carry that carefulness into every room, especially the rooms that had hurt us before. You can say, we held hands and we didn't stop. The last time we drove home at dusk on that highway, the sky went that same quilt of lavender and blue, but I wasn't nervous. The field spread out like a deep breath, and every mile said, you remember who you are, don't you? And I did. We turned on the bell by the back door and went inside and set our keys in the dish and called my mother to tell her we were home, and she said, good, I saved you pie. And we laughed, and he kissed my cheek in the kitchen. And I took a pen from the cup on the counter and wrote down the thing I never want to forget. Sometimes the fake boyfriend brings you to the real feeling, not by pretending to love you, but by making room for you to love yourself, and that's when everything else finds its place.